Dear friends, it is the 4th of November, and I want to talk about the dismal state of infrastructure in India and what can be done about it. This issue is not something that's unknown to anybody. The moment you enter India, apart from a couple of airports which are built in the private sector, everything else in the public sector, which is the roads, is you start seeing the degradation immediately within a few kilometers of the international airport. And even around Delhi, where I live in Palam Vihar, the roads not only break up completely, they are flooded like crazy during the slightest downpour. There are no drains on the sides of the roads. There are no footpaths. There are splashes, heaps and heaps of rubbish on the sides. The waterways are completely, filled with the extreme form of rubbish. And that is just one example. But there, you go anywhere in India, and you find the problems like the absence of water, the absence of electricity, the absence of piped gas, for example, that's simply not available anywhere in India, as far as I know. And the public transport, broken systems everywhere. The railways, the most defunct railways in the world potentially. That's what India is. And you compare India with even countries like China, which are so-called communist countries, and you soon come to the view that, my God, even the communists can do a much better job than India. In fact, I have studied some of these Chinese companies, public sector companies, and some of them provide the kind of quality that's not found even in the best private sector companies in the entire world. So we're talking of, for example, electricity grid companies. These companies in China have developed the longest grids in the world, electricity grids, and with the least amount of wastage of electricity. So there's virtually no loss of electricity across thousands of kilometers. That's an amazing achievement, and it's happened in China. I've not been to China, but the photographs of China's infrastructure development are absolutely mind-boggling to a person who is used to things like India. In fact, I have been to China. Now that I think about it, I have went on a China Airlines, and I think Guangzhou or whatever that place is called, the airport. It was, I wouldn't say a customer-friendly airport, but it was really well done. But that's not a good example of what China is and what China's infrastructure. However, before I talk too much about China and even places like Singapore, where there's a lot of public sector involvement in infrastructure, I want to sort of step back a little bit and ask the question whether infrastructure is something that the government has a role in. We sort of assume in general that because it's a public good in many cases that there is a role for infrastructure, for government in infrastructure provision. But really, if you step back for a second, the moment you're able to actually separate out individual use and charges, and you can actually then charge for that particular use, then it no longer remains a public good in that sense. It becomes a private good. Water, electricity are good examples, or pipe gas, for example, or toll roads. Even, you can think of trains and trams and so on, and buses. They really don't have to be anywhere in the public sector. They can be regulated. They can be some essential infrastructure to run these can be provided. For example, a train, the main lines can be provided in some manner by the government, or not provided, but let's say facilitated. Or in a bus rapid transport system, the government could facilitate the actual road on which the bus rapid transport companies, the private companies, provide the bus services. There's a huge mix of things that can happen in this space, but the last thing we need to do is to make the assumption that the government has to supply infrastructure. I think about irrigation, for example. There are examples all over the world where irrigation is supplied privately. And if you go back in the history of infrastructure, this becomes more obvious what I'm saying about the role of government. For example, even a road, simple thing like a road, you'd say that no, the government has a role in providing roads. But actually, if you go back in time and look at the history of roads, yes, modern, developments and modern precincts which are being created through planning, they do have new roads being created by the government in a sense and in a planned sense. But if you go back in history where, roads between houses, between different houses in a village, or roads between different villages, one village to the other, or the one village to the nearest town, these kind of roads were all the outcome of people regularly traveling on a path and making a path. And this is something not only humans do, but also other species of animals. And the best example is elephants in jungles. They always create a path on which they travel, and they know the jungles very well and where to go for a salt lake or for whatever, water and so on. And they trample their paths in the jungles. This is how humans also created the paths. And we look at the hills in the villages in the hills, and we find the same issue. So essentially, these paths are nothing but footpaths created by continuous walking on those from one end to the other. And then they slowly become roads when people want to put more heavy things like bullock carts, and then potentially even buses in the future, and so on and so forth. So roads themselves have evolved through voluntary human interactions, and they're not necessarily the result of government creation. So that's something to remember. And of course, if you look at things like telecom and water, airports, electricity, trams, railways, irrigation, all over the world, you'd find there's a very significant, in many, if not all cases, the initiation was done by the private sector. With R.L. Stevenson's train, it was a private sector enterprise. If you go back in history, everywhere you find private sector has created infrastructure. And so why then does the government get involved? Well, what normally would happen is because of competition in this business and changes in the environment. For example, suddenly there's now, after the cars came into being, there was an expansion of cities into the suburbs, which meant that bus routes, which were earlier, very economic and viable, generally in the nearby the central business district, they became less viable. And so these bus companies went around lobbying the government to take them over. And governments always pick losers. And I keep emphasizing this. And I think it is Henry Urgus who first mentioned this in one of the conferences I attended. And I sort of stuck with me that governments always pick losers, Instead of picking winners, we are very good at picking losers as a government. And any business that starts losing in a competition will immediately run to government as if it's a mummy, papa, or whatever, and ask to be taken over. And this is what governments generally do. For whatever reason, there's corruption involved as well in this particular thing. It's easy to give away some money in order to get the benefit of government guarantees of some sort. So you don't. You can easily expect a lot of corruption to take place in these kind of things. India, of course, it definitely does take place, but India also has the ideological tendency of people like Nehru, who are not necessarily personally corrupt, but these were ideological socialists who said, no, the government must do everything in any case. And so that's how India's first constitutional amendment was about Nehru taking over the bus companies, in UP. And so I wrote in my book, Breaking Free of Nehru, that Nehru had this great passion to run buses. And what the hell, why does the government have to run a bus? I mean, is that something that is the job of a government? I mean, come and have a think about it. Why do we create governments? Do we create governments to run our buses? No, we create governments to provide us security and our justice. These are the two basic things, and that includes defense and police and the justice system. And of course, we want the government to keep a record of our property rights, and to ensure that our property rights are protected in land and any other property that we have. And that includes contracts and so on, and assurance that our contracts are honored by the others, because that's the role of the umpire, the government, and that's what the core function is of the government. Therefore, I would say that I just wanted to, take this detour into this issue of the role of government, because everything must start with that question: that what is the role of government? And I think I have sort of suggested to you, the listener, that no, there is no fundamental role of government in infrastructure. There may be a role, and often there is a role actually, but that's mostly in the space of setting up the market, setting up the regulatory system, preventing monopolistic behavior, or and many times this is not easy, but I would say that it is much better for a government to enable the private sector to manage these things than to try to do it by itself, because the incentives within government to destroy the viability of infrastructure are so severe, and we can see that on a daily basis in India. We don't need too many examples. India itself is a big example of everything broken down and run down and simply unviable. We don't have any infrastructure. I see in Australia B doubles and the bus trains, which are large, huge buses, or sorry, not buses, the trucks, very large trucks carrying things all over the country, and that's because the roads can take care of these, capacity. And in India we have really tiny trucks. They can't travel anywhere. The roads are in very bad shape. Maybe we have a couple of highways, and after that, immediately the thing deteriorates. And even those highways were basically built with foreign enterprise, and foreign investment. We simply don't have the capacity to do anything ourselves, and that's a good thing for us to actually get out now from infrastructure. In almost all infrastructure, we should start privatizing. But I'll come to that separately. But because the privatization is not something that can be done by the current form of government we have in India. Modi can't do anything about it because he's following the same socialist model and the same colonial model. And so let's say that there is some role of government in infrastructure. Then the first question to ask is, do we have a machine of government that can actually deliver that? And the answer in India is no. We really don't have the kind of machine that is honest. The politicians, were honest, and therefore the bureaucrats were honest. And I will go back in my experience, and I'll mention briefly my experience in DRDA, the District Rural Development Agency in Dhubri, and also my experience with as a director of rural development later, my experience with Hiteshwar Saikia and my ministers. So in DRDA Dhubri, I used to, we had money to build infrastructure for villages, including roads and buildings and training centers and schools and whatnot. And there I was amazed at the kind of quality and the magnitude of the work that I could get done at 1/3 the price of what PWD was quoting, because we had an engineer within our organization who was a very honest man, and he was able to get the stuff, estimates made and get the work done at such extraordinarily low prices, but the very high quality. It was a bit of a shock, I'm sure, to the entire PWD in the district, that here's a man who is getting some things of extraordinary quality done at such a low price. And that sort of demonstrated to me how massively inflated the costs of infrastructure are in India's government. And of course, we were very good at catching corruption. There was a lot of corruption happening in the supply of cement and everything else, and we used to go and catch that the bad suppliers. And really, it was quite a big piece of work and many of these suppliers were coming from the state government, where there was massive corruption. And by the way, later that's what I was going to talk about. I finally was made a director of rural development for Assam, the entire state with the second largest budget in any director, or rather of any department. And it was a very big role to get hundreds of crores rupees. At that time it was a big amount of money. Now it's probably thousands, hundreds of crores of rupees of worth of rural development done efficiently and honestly. And the first thing, so I was appointed during the governor's rule, where there was no scope for corruption, because the governor's advisors were very honest people. But when you come to the moment Hiteshwar Saikia became the chief minister, things started becoming very difficult. And first of all, my minister wanted to get all the files where all these various things are being purchased and done. And he would hold the file, and I was like, what the hell? I mean, why are you holding the file? You need to keep moving on this particular exercise. And in all cases, I realized that there's a lot of talk about taking cuts from the suppliers and this and that, and I got these rumors about the corruption that is going on, and I could not do much about it. But anyway, that the files were simply stuck with the minister. Nothing happened for a long time. I wasn't there for too long anyway, so I'm talking of a few weeks really here. I was kicked out very soon. Then we had this Hiteshwar Saikia, the chief minister, who called me. So there was a contract for cement for the whole state for DRDAs, and that was a very large contract, a few crores of rupees, and the lowest was the Cement Corporation of India, Bokajan, that's in Assam actually, and then that particular corporations also had a 10% a preference under the rules of the government. In any case, the thing was very competitive, and the others were much higher. But Mr. Hitesha Saikia, the crook, called me to his office and took me to the cabinet room, which is just behind his office, and sat me in that cabinet room, the big one. We were the only two persons, and he started whispering into my ears, "Can you get this contract to this particular party?" And that was the private party. Was, I think, the third in the bid, very expensive. And I said Sambaru, which is basically saying I'll have a look, which is basically I couldn't say much at that time. I couldn't really spit at his face. I would have spat on his face perhaps. That would have been a good thing. But I was still interested in continuing with my career at that stage. So I went back and then I looked at the data. There was no possibility of this company getting this lowest this tender. So I gave it to Cement Corporation of India, and within days I was transferred out of that post, which is what I had expected anyway. So you can see the kind of levels of corruption happening at the top. As chief minister, rural development, 100% corrupt. There's not even a 0.1% chance of these guys being honest. They're 100% corrupt. So anybody trying to fight corruption, will be kicked out, and that's what happened to me. And I finally left the job, which is a different issue. But the point I'm making here is very important to remember, that you cannot privatize anything with this kind of a system. In fact, we had a large series of privatizations in Assam, and I came to know there was a massive amount of corruption, and vast amount of government resources were basically sold away for a pittance, and the money was basically pocketed by the ministers and the chief ministers. And this is the kind of thing I don't want to happen in India, where infrastructure is privatized without having the kind of governance system that can actually deal with this issue. You need a totally honest bureaucracy and political leadership. Without that, there's no chance. So now for the rest of a few minutes, where I want to talk a little bit more about infrastructure policy, I want to sort of assume for a minute, let's whitewash the whole thing. Let's assume that I have all the reforms that Swarna Bharat Party talks about, that I've been writing about for so many years, 20 years. Let's assume that all those reforms have now been implemented. And so we now have a system where there are honest politicians and there are good, competent bureaucrats. Now, what should be done? And that's the real issue of policy. The policy for infrastructure, as I've already alluded to, must look at the original evolution of that piece of infrastructure. What's the history of that? Was there a private sector participation and involvement? For example, Air India. Was there a history? Of course there was a history. It was taken over by Nehru, the socialist, ideologue. He took it over and destroyed the whole thing, destroyed India as well in so many ways. But let's say he destroyed Air India. And so now that is something that should be immediately privatized. In fact, honestly speaking, that should be given back to the Tatas because it was stolen from them. Similarly, we could probably have the historical analysis of many other such things and give them back to the original owners. That would be really good to do. The other one is where we don't have history, but we have taken over things like hotels and women, doing all these things. Then, of course, we should privatize them straight away. We don't need hotel is not an infrastructure, but people were saying it's a tourism infrastructure. That's why they built it. Well, we don't need it. The private sector can do that and has always done it. So why don't we simply give it back sell it off to the private sector at the highest rate through auctions and so on? And then comes the things like roads and things like ports and electricity supply and water and so on. And each of these requires a very specialist and detailed analysis. And I won't go into details here, but I just alluded to that there is no fundamental reason for government to hold on to any of these. Okay, but for actual analysis of each of these, we require the kind of expertise that we cannot possibly get in India today. The level of expertise I see, for example, around me in Victoria, Australia, with public-private partnerships being of very high quality, that's not something that's available at the kind of with the governance system we get in India. So without that kind of a system, I would not expect any of that to happen. So I would see the sequence as follows. The first step necessarily has to be the Swarna Bharat Party must rule India. There is no other choice for India. If it does not do it, then India is going to remain a shambles for the next hundreds of years. It's not possible to change Swarna Bharat Party. But remember, there is a lot of detail which only I unfortunately have knowledge of, having worked in both, having spent half my career in India and in Australia. Not something commonly known, and I can assure you that nobody in the World Bank knows about it because these guys are total idiots who are writing absolute nonsense. In fact, we have people like Land Pritchett saying that India's IS is an incredible service. I'm sorry, but this is the most hopeless unaccountable and incompetent service in the world. It is well known, well documented in all comparative studies. How can you possibly call it incredible? That means you really don't understand anything. You're a Harvard School Kennedy School professor, but you really don't know anything that is worth talking about. So India does not need to get advice from these useless organizations like World Bank and IMF. What we need is very high quality, competent people who are hired from the open market and are given a particular job to do, and if they deliver, that's fine, they do, they remain, otherwise they go. And this reminds me of people like Lee Kuan Yew, whose model of governance we need to consider, and similar models we need to adopt. And I'm not talking of his absence of democracy, because we need democracy. Okay, that's something I support. Democracy has its pros and cons, but at the end of the day, I would rather have democracy in India than a kind of dictatorship, with the risk that it'll become ultimately a damaged country completely because of the dictatorship. What we need, therefore, is governance reform initially, and then we start doing the infrastructure building in India, because without the first step, I'm sorry guys, but you cannot possibly get good infrastructure in India. So the delusions that people have about Swachh Bharat and all that, I've been talking about it, writing about it. Please be assured that you will achieve nothing. Mr. Modi is useless, absolutely will achieve zero, 100% zero, no chance of doing anything. Mr. Arvind Kejriwal, an absolute duffer. He knows nothing of governance whatsoever. He's, very populist, and he's going around talking nonsense. And the country is being smitten by these kind of people. And of course, we have idiots like Rahul Gandhi, who's unable to even read probably his own name. This kind of a character who's there because of heredity. I mean, what in heaven's name does he know? What has he written? What is his single, claim to fame, that he is the so-called vice president or whatever of the Congress party? And his mother, the wife married to a dynasty. This is the kind of nonsense we have in India. I cannot believe the kind of rubbish we are seeing in India for 70 years, which is why I have said I'm not going to work in this rubbish system. I'm going to create the system that I would like to see for India. Now it's up to you guys whether you want a similar system, whether you want to see change. If you want me to get involved, you better do it soon, because time is running out for me. Okay, guys. Okay, so that's something I want to mention now very clearly. Time's running out for me. You want me to get involved, you better start responding. Otherwise, I will just say what I have to say. I'll write what I have to say. And then after 25, 30 years of my death, you can start doing whatever you feel is necessary. But really the basic point I want to make is that good infrastructure is essential for any country. India has one of the world's worst infrastructure. Therefore, also, no opportunities for people, and everybody's buying generators to run their electricity. And the generators are so expensive. You need cheap electricity to run the system. China has some of the cheapest electricity in the world. This is how China is moving. Okay, it has moved so far ahead of India. And I'm not saying China is a good model, but China is a model which has built in some accountability and some governance reforms, which stupid people in the World Bank guys don't understand. I am once again, emphasizing, in the context of infrastructure, the only thing that you need to understand now at this stage is you need governance reforms, India, and you need the listener to start supporting this particular work that I'm doing, that Swarna Party is doing. Join the party, fund the party, talk about the party, spread the message, get involved. Otherwise, you guys are in deep trouble, and I'm not going to be around very long to support you guys, because I think I'm going to be running out of time after some time. Anyway, all that's good, and this is the way the world runs. I will do my best. This podcast is out there. Whether you listen to it today or after 30 years is your problem. Thank you. Bye.